Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents American Heritage History of the United States by Douglas Brinkley. Read by Eric Martin. Introduction. Almost all of us have some dream power in our childhood, but without encouragement it leaves us, and then we become bored and tired and ordinary. We are carefully coached in the most modern and efficient ways of making our bodies comfortable, and we become so busy about getting ourselves all nicely placed that we are apt to forget the dream spirit that is born in all of us. Grant Wood. Since I was a boy growing up in Perrysburg, Ohio, a town of 8,000 named for Oliver Hazard Perry, the famous commodore who won the Battle of Lake Erie in the War of 1812, allowing the peaceful settlement of the Northwest Territory, the study of American history has been my passion. When I look back and try to understand how that infatuation sprang to life, a pattern of experiences appears. The earliest harks back to my elementary school teacher, Ned Hoffman, and his riveting stories about how our placid Maumee River community was part of the Black Swamp, where in 1810 Amos Spafford, the first white settler in the area, had been forced to combat both horrendous lightning fires and deadly cholera. Then, when I turned 8, a local boy made better than good. On July 20th, 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong of Wapakoneta, Ohio, became the first human being to set foot on the moon, disembarking from the Eagle landing module and proclaiming, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." At the time, the Vietnam War was a gruesome blur on the nightly news, but the Apollo 11 moon mission was undaunted heroism of the first order. When the Neil Armstrong Air and Space Museum opened in 1972, I was one of the first in line to see the moon rock exhibit. Soon I would enjoy a steady diet of high school field trips to such nearby sites as Thomas Edison's birthplace in Milan, Rutherford B. Hayes's Shady Grove estate in Fremont, and Sherwood Anderson's hometown of Clyde, which served as the model for my favorite book, Winesburg, Ohio, 1919. The fact that only Virginia had produced more presidents than Ohio, 8 to 7, contributed to my provincial pride. One summer at a Lucas County Fair gift stand, I purchased a $3 portfolio containing frameable sketches of the pantheon of Ohio-born presidents, Ulysses S. Grant being my favorite. Occasionally, our teachers would chaperone us across the state line to visit Johnny Appleseed's grave in Fort Wayne, Indiana, or Gerald Ford's hometown of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Without fail, these day trips filled me with a sense of the history that occurred in my own backyard. The War of 1812 had swirled around Perrysburg, where in 1813 General William Henry Harrison had built Fort Meigs and bravely held out against numerous British attacks through that spring and summer. The fort became known as the Gibraltar of the Northwest, and in 1840, when Harrison was running his log cabin campaign for president, he revisited Fort Meigs. But the motherlode of all field trips was our annual school excursion to automotive pioneer Henry Ford's Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, 50 miles away. In 1929, Ford had determined to create a unique museum where Americans could learn how their ancestors had lived and worked. The village consists of more than 80 historical structures on an 81-acre site. Most of the buildings were brought from other states and represent a variety of time periods. Some are the homes or workshops of famous thinkers and inventors such as Thomas Edison, Noah Webster, and George Washington Carver, but the majority had less famous residents. Although today, as a professional historian, I have to question the rationale behind moving a historical building from its original location to a theme park in Michigan, there is no denying that, as a youth, Greenfield Village excited me like no other place. School was not the only source of my urge to become an American historian. There were also the family vacations, during which my father, mother, sister, and I crisscrossed our nation in search of our past, present, and future. A blue Pontiac station wagon and a 24-foot pale cream coachman trailer became our Buckeye Buggy, as we named it. We traditionally began planning our annual trip in late winter, and historical destinations such as Mount Vernon or Hull House were always part of the itinerary. There was something magical about deciding where our summer journey would take us. An overcast, cold winter evening became pregnant with the possibility of entering the very room where Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, or of walking the very streets of Independence, Missouri, where the ghost of Harry Truman would be your companion. My father and I would sit at our kitchen table, a well-worn road atlas and a KOA campground guide open in front of us, and together plot our route in exact detail. He was Lewis, and I was Clark, as we made our careful preparations for that big July day when America's historical sites would open up before our very eyes. Both of my parents were high school humanities teachers, so books and periodicals were everywhere in our home. Family favorites were the illustrated histories and magazines published by American Heritage, which blended the techniques of journalism with the discipline of history into works enjoyable either to read straight through or to browse at random. It was in Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Bruce Catton's Civil War volume that I first encountered the stark sepia daguerreotype photographs that Matthew Brady had made of soldiers, and saw the unfathomable squalor of Andersonville Prison. These books had the same integrity of presentation that had become the hallmark of American Heritage magazine. Given this teenage exposure to all things American Heritage, it came as a delightful shock when editor Richard Snow asked me, in 1995, if I would write the history of the United States. My next reaction was hesitation. The notion of synthesizing 500 years of history into a single volume was almost too overwhelming to contemplate. But then I recalled what novelist Sinclair Lewis had said when he received the 1930 Nobel Prize for Literature. Our American professors like their literature clear and cold and pure and very dead. Lewis had a point. It had seemed to me, too, that American history professors needed to make studying our nation's past more accessible and less dreary. Those concerned with popular education must realize that most people are not susceptible to any dry scholarship, historian James Thomas Flexner noted in Random Harvest, 1998, a collection of gem-like essays. However, a history book that is well written can reach and persuade a large audience. It was the combination of how important American heritage had been to me growing up and wanting to turn others on to our 500-year drama that persuaded me to write this Greenfield Village-like book. But saying yes and signing the contract were the easy parts. Obviously, the story of the United States is far too grand and sweeping to capture between two covers, or even a few hundred covers. In order to write American Heritage's first history of the United States, I would thus have to make a choice of approach and many decisions about what to include and what would have to be excluded for space. It tormented me how much history would have to be left out. Before a single word was written, I had nightmares about receiving letters expressing disappointment, from the American Red Cross complaining that I never mentioned Clara Barton, from football fans denouncing me for leaving out the NFL, from urbane scholars scoffing that it's impossible to write about the Cold War without mentioning the Quemoy and Matsu crisis. But once I overcame those fears, writing this illustrated history, drawn largely from lecture notes I've used at the U.S. Naval Academy, Princeton University, Hofstra University, and the University of New Orleans, has been a rewarding challenge. To appreciate the American heritage history of the United States, it is essential to understand that this book is not, and in no way pretends to be, a comprehensive history of our nation's origins and developments. As novelist Thomas Wolfe once noted, there are a billion forms of America, and it's simply impossible to understand, much less explain them all. It is, however, my intent to put U.S. economic and political history into a coherent perspective, less through a linear narrative than via a series of 22 essays divided as chapters. My main objective is to demonstrate that America's economic dynamism is the engine that drives our political, social, and civic lives. As Dutch historian and journalist Hendrik von Loon once observed, "The history of the world is the record of a man in quest of his daily bread and butter." A volume meant to pique the general reader's interest in U.S. history, this book is not aimed to please academic scholars or specialists. Instead, my approach draws from author Barbara Tuchman, who, when asked what the role of the historian is, replied, "To make it known." After all, the Library of Congress houses more than 30,000 volumes on the Civil War alone. My brief synthesis chapter here does not claim to add anything to the historiography on the subject. Rather, I hope this book supports Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s belief that history, by putting crisis in perspective, supplies an antidote to every generation's illusion that its own problems are uniquely oppressive. The reader should be apprised of a few other considerations before starting this book. Given the space limitations, I was unable to properly address many significant issues, such as some points of Native American history. "Do you know who I am?" Sitting Bull asked a delegation of U.S. senators visiting the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in 1883. The answer, then as now, should be a resounding yes, but it is not adequately proclaimed in the narrative that follows. When Columbus landed in the New World in 1492, he found a highly developed society of approximately 75 million people speaking nearly 2,000 different languages. These indigenous people were hardly backward. They had built grand cities and monuments, developed sophisticated astronomical observatories, solar calendars, and healing medicines, and created exquisite works of art. Perhaps most important, these native inhabitants had what historian N. Scott Momaday has called a spiritual comprehension of the universe. Instead of trying to squeeze in a few perfunctory paragraphs on the beauty and depth of Native American culture, I chose to focus on the Europeans' arrival in the New World, these adventurers' lust for riches, and the consequences of both. Readers looking for more about indigenous societies can find an in-depth examination in editor Alvin M. Josephy Jr.'s America in 1492, The World of the Indian Peoples Before the Arrival of Columbus, 1991, which offers accurate descriptions of what the Americas were like before the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Finally, about the cover. After careful consideration, I selected Grant Wood's fantasy farmscape, Stone City. Although most Americans know Wood, a native of Iowa, for his famous 1930 painting American Gothic, permanently housed at the Chicago Art Institute, but regularly reproduced on everything from cornflake boxes to computer commercials, he was, in fact, a prolific student of the American Midwest. In his 1987 book, Grant Wood, A Study in American Art and Culture, James M. Dennis provides a remarkable explication of Stone City, the bulbous trees, the modern bridge built over the Wapsipinicon River, the curlicuing roadways, descending sun, and toyland buildings in a churchless farm town. But whatever its technical merits and flaws, Stone City, a bucolic Midwestern dreamscape, triggers the history-minded imagination in varied ways. Gazing at the painting makes me realize, for example, how different U.S. roads are from those in Europe. The highways of America ribbon into an endless horizon, where in Europe they typically end or begin in an enclosed communal space, a piazza, a place, an agora, a forum. The old adage that all roads lead to Rome applies in every great European capital. All roads converge upon the city. But the American pattern is different, as manifest destiny dictates. The grid disperses population centers outward, which is perhaps not surprising in a nation born of the pioneering frontier spirit. And so, Grant Wood's road still rolls on today, into the sleepy suburbs and their industrial parks, on into the abundant countryside, through Nebraska's wheat farms and Colorado's Rocky Mountains, to Promontory Point in Utah, where the Transcontinental Railroad's golden spike connected east to west, to the slot arcades of Reno and the domed Capitol in Sacramento, to Silicon Valley and on to the Hawaiian Islands, to our military bases in South Korea and throughout Western Europe. Woods Road did not begin in Iowa. It opened on the Atlantic coast when the first settlers hitched their wagons and started plowing westward. Now the American road spans the globe, and the vehicles of our progress keep driving on, forward toward the next horizon. It is my hope that this book will inspire the pioneers of tomorrow to take a moment from their rush onward, to ponder the ways of our past, and to learn from them. Douglas Brinkley. Chapter 1. Setting the Stage. Your Highnesses have another world here, by which our holy faith can be so greatly advanced, and from which such great wealth can be drawn. So wrote Christopher Columbus to the King and Queen of Spain on October 18, 1498, after his third voyage across the ocean. Yet he didn't have any real idea of what he had found and what he had started. How could he have? Who could have imagined the vast lands that stretched thousands of miles beyond anything he had seen, the tens of millions of people living there, and the death and devastation he and his successors had already begun to bring upon them, and the future empires that would grow up on the lands they inhabited? Who, above all, could have imagined the new kind of civilization, the world's first experimental civilization, that centuries later would arise as the United States of America? Columbus went to his grave in 1506, still boasting that he had discovered a new route to Asia. Nonetheless, Columbus's tales of the strange lands he visited and the riches they held captivated Europeans, just as the tales of Marco Polo and the legendary explorer Prester John had captivated them centuries earlier. The human spirit had begun to stir in Western Europe in the late 15th century, and Europeans had begun to reach outward, down and around the coast of Africa, far to the distant east, and into the unknown Atlantic. After the long, dull stasis of the Dark and Middle Ages, from the 5th through the 14th centuries, when religious Philistinism held sway, and after the bubonic plague had wiped out nearly one-third the population of Europe between 1348 and 1350, people in every country, at every level of society, and in every realm of human endeavor, were eager for change. This restlessness eventually spawned economic growth, a revival of the arts, and a passion for nation-building. For a time, however, the mere suggestions of what later would be dubbed the Commercial Revolution, the Renaissance, and the Reformation disturbed Europe's intellectuals, divided the powerful church, and agitated everyone from king to peasant with the threat of transforming the most basic ways life was lived. Many felt the winds of change, but few agreed as to their meaning. Some observers thought any change presaged the end of European civilization through invasions by groups such as the Turks, while others feared the growing anti-church sentiments would lead to bloody conflicts that even the might of the Pope could not quell. Amid the confusion, a small handful of Europeans, particularly in port cities, saw more reason for hope than for fear. These early capitalists believed their continent's future depended on its commercial ties to other lands in every direction, Asia, Africa, and whatever lay beyond the known world. Such forward thinking was, however, a minority view. Most Europeans looked at the changing society as they had always regarded everything, as necessarily focused around the Mediterranean Sea that had been the center of Western civilization for all 5,000 years of its existence. At the time, it was hard to imagine political and social power developing anywhere else. After all, since the early medieval era 8 centuries earlier, Western Europe had been divided between the world's two mightiest entities, the nobility and the papacy, which had struggled for power with one another far more often than they had joined together against common foes. Victory usually had gone to Rome, but that began to change toward the end of the 15th century. The Church had been weakened by internal corruption and schisms, allowing kings across the continent to seize power from local bishops and then to flout papal policies and directives. Throughout Europe, monarchs ruled over nation-states that were becoming ever more secular, and their populations worldlier and less pious, not to mention ever more interested in the kingdoms on earth than in the promised one of heaven. Nowhere was this transformation more apparent than in Britain, which had been ripped apart over the preceding 200 years by court intrigues, troubles with Rome, a bloody 100 Years' War with France, and a struggle for the throne between the houses of Lancaster and York, known as the Wars of the Roses. It wasn't until 1485 that Britain's agony appeared to end with the coronation of Henry VII, who then spent 10 years quashing coup attempts before Charles VIII of France gave him the support he needed to sustain his rule. At the time, the resulting rapprochement between Britain and France seemed the most important event of 1492. After a period of political turmoil of its own, France was united and free from foreign influence, which allowed Charles VIII to turn to his fondest project, the conquest of Italy, the epicenter of civilization since before the Christian era that had made Rome so dominant and over the centuries so domineering. By the late 15th century, however, Italy comprised a patchwork of monarchies, republics, and factional papal states, none of which trusted any of the others. It was a disunion that seemed to augur well for the French and badly for the Italians. The particularly ineffectual papacy of Innocent VIII allowed the election of Rodrigo Borgia, who succeeded him in 1492 as Pope Alexander VI, and devoted his reign to aggrandizing his notorious family, a decadent lot given to unsavory political machinations, sexual escapades, and the fairly indiscriminate use of poison rings. Italy, for so long the heart and soul of Europe, was insular, rudderless, and, as a consequence, threatened from all sides. The greatest menace came from the east in the form of the Turks, who deemed the country a great prize. Sultan Bayezid II wanted to follow in the footsteps of his father, Mehmed II, who had conquered Constantinople and expanded the Ottoman Empire to the Balkans, Greece, and Bosnia, in the process cutting Western trade and other contacts with the Byzantine Empire that then dominated southeastern Europe. But Italy was eyed just as hungrily from the west by Spain's shrewd King Ferdinand II. Although in the mid-15th century his nation was splintered by geography, religion, culture, and language, Catalan being spoken in the east and northeast, Castilian in the north and central regions, Arabic in the far south, and various Hebrew dialects across the entire Iberian Peninsula, the calculating king had plans. Ferdinand had assumed power in Aragon in 1479, but it was his strategic marriage to Queen Isabella of Castile, who had come to him for help, that united their two small nation-states into what would become Spain, a sovereign power strong enough to drive back incursions from Portugal, the Holy Roman Empire, and in 1492 expel both the Moors, Muslims whose ancestors had invaded Spain in the 8th century, from Granada, and the Jews from across the nascent nation. That momentous year, 1492, thus marked any number of turning points for Europe. To observers of the time, it looked as though the future hinged on political maneuvers in northern Italy, from which either France or the Holy Roman Empire would likely emerge as the continent's dominant power. Britain and Spain, both led by strong kings and graced with abundant access to the seas, seemed likely to prosper, but their distance from the supposed center of power made them unlikely to prevail. In 1492, Europe's heart remained in Rome, and its major arteries still wound along the Mediterranean Sea. Populations grew across Western Europe, thus creating a need for trade routes over land as well as over the seas. The economic boom in 15th century Europe was paced by a sharp upturn in commerce growing out of the rise of population and migration. Local markets in more communities teemed with business and multiplied in both size and number. The most dramatic expansion occurred in the long, crucial seaports where Europe made contact with the rest of the world, but cities throughout the continent's interior also blossomed, as overland trade was conducted over greater distances rarely traversed since the fall of the Roman Empire. The inadequacy of 15th century Europe's road systems quickly grew into a major problem as the volume of trade expanded along with the population. Most goods sent overland were toted by pack animals or in wheeled carts on rutted dirt paths. Aside from a few thoroughfares in Lombardy that were kept open year-round, most roads were unpaved, neglected, and impassable in poor weather. Even the marvelous road system that was perhaps the greatest legacy of the Roman Empire had fallen into near irretrievable disrepair during the Middle Ages, when most Europeans simply had no need of roads. During that timid era, the vast majority of people seldom ventured more than a few miles from the small hamlets in which they had been born, raised, and married, and where they lived and died, nestled among generations of their families and friends. When the occasional need or longing for travel did arise, therefore, sea routes usually proved easier, faster, and a lot cheaper. For much of the 15th century, vessels from Genoa and Florence engaged in regular trade at ports throughout the Hanseatic League, a loose confederation of northern European cities principally along the coasts of the Baltic Sea. Although these sea routes covered longer distances, prices for shipping goods averaged less than 1/50th what land transport cost. In fact, the round ships used in Mediterranean trade, which could carry nearly 800 tons of cargo apiece, were not only faster, but in most cases more reliable than the horse and mule-drawn wagons and carriages that were their overland counterparts. The round ships were also noticeably lucrative, so it wasn't long before the financial attractions of sea trading inspired technological innovations aimed at making it even more profitable. The 15th century witnessed great advances in shipbuilding techniques and the engineering of navigational equipment such as the compass and astrolabe, the precursor to the sextant. Accurate maps, called portolani, began to be produced in Spain and northern Italy and found their way across the continent. These maps showed landforms, winds, currents, and tides, although not latitude nor longitude. Ship captains therefore needed great skill in reading winds and tides if they hoped to sail out of sight of land for any length of time, not that many were so bold. Although men, and the occasional woman of means, could and did travel from place to place across Europe to study, conduct business, or pursue various pilgrimages, voyages beyond the continent were rare. But boundaries vex the human spirit, and before long, visionaries and adventurers began looking for ways to broaden the world. These bold mariners ignored the daunting risks and opened the way to the forging not only of new nations, but of a new civilization based on interdependence among states in every portion of the globe. It is little wonder that explorers' stories of discovery remain so enticing across the centuries. In fact, it was the tales brought back from faraway lands by the first few individuals brave enough to have made the journeys that helped fuel the passion for unknown realms. Various popes, of course, had been sending emissaries to the Far East for hundreds of years. In the 13th century, one John of Plano Carpini had been dispatched to Asia as papal representative to the Mongol court of Genghis Khan at Karakoram in Central Asia, and returned to write and speak widely of his experiences and discoveries. Another envoy sent by Louis IX of France, William de Rubrucus, traveled to the northwestern Himalayas, to Karakoram, and to other eastern cities, then fascinated scholars with his writings on the Orient. But history depends as much upon who reads it as who writes it, and it was Marco Polo who best knew his audience and how to play to their interests. Polo and some of his family had left Constantinople for China in 1260, and 11 years later he embarked on his monumental overland journey through Asia. It was not until 1298, while in a Genoese prison after being captured in a sea battle, that Polo dictated his epical Book of Sir Marco Polo, the Venetian, concerning the kingdoms and marvels of the East.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?